Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. How has the pandemic, in obvious ways but also in ways that are less obvious, impacted higher education? And how many changes that have unexpectedly come about in colleges and universities across the world are here to stay for the long haul? That's our discussion for today. Let's welcome our guests who have joined us for this conversation. First with us today is Dr. Amina Muazzam, who's an expert educationist and social scientist with a broad focus on cutting-edge technology. She joins us from Lahore. Also joining us today is Dr. Mariam Durrani, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Hamilton College, joining us from New York. Mr. Nick Hamilton, who's the director of Higher Education Policy Institute, the UK's only independent think tank devoted to higher education, joining us from Oxford, and Dr. Nadia Siddiqui, who is an associate professor at Durham Evidence Center School of Education at Durham University. She joins us from Durham. Thank you all for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Nick, let me begin with you. And I know you're talking to us from Oxford right now, but I'd like you to take a global lens and try to give me an answer to this question. How deeply has higher education been impacted by this pandemic?
Learning on a university campus is a social endeavor, and you have tens of thousands of students and thousands of members of staff all together at the same time. And in the UK and in many other countries in the world, that's had to stop temporarily. A lot of learning moved online. Here in the UK and again in other countries, we're gearing up for the new academic year, and we want that to be as normal as possible, but it won't be completely normal. You know, there'll be masks worn, a lot of lectures will be online, students will have to stick with more limited social groups than in the past. So it will be different. It will be different, but the appetite for learning and the commitment of staff are just as strong as they were before.
Right. Nadia, talking about these changes, how permanent and how long-term do you think they will be? Do you see any irreversible changes in how the landscape of education has been impacted by the pandemic?
As it says, like, that situation is not going back to the normal. We can't say what would normal look like in the next coming few years. However, as I see, this has opened a huge opportunities for the developing countries, because I think that we were so worried, can we launch online education as a primary pedagogy? That was the main fear. What will be the role of university, for example, if it's all online or if it is a remote distance learning education that we adopt? Certainly, we know that a blended approach is possible. We are communicating through media, we are communicating through internet. Children of very young age learning school at a very early years. If that's possible, then I believe that's an opportunity for us, and we should just thrive on it rather than saying it's irreversible or not reversible. We are not sure how far this pandemic will go and what will the world look like. But I certainly believe that it has opened a lot of opportunities. It has shown things can work across the globe, across time zones, just using internet technology. Learning is possible. Right. And I would see it a very positive sign.
Right. Let me take this question to you. You're talking to us from New York. We know that the United States has one of the largest populations of international students. Do you see it in the same light, that this has been an unprecedented opportunity for international students and it's theirs to seize?
I think this has given unprecedented challenges to international students. I think that students at this point are taking classes online. For example, I know several students in Pakistan who are starting master's programs and starting PhD programs from home in Islamabad or in Jarsadda, for example. And it really presents a lot of challenges for students in terms of managing the time zone, managing what the expectations are, being able to access the internet on a regular basis, having consistent service, and all the other kinds of upheavals that are being caused by this pandemic right now. And so I think that students, especially international students, are facing very unique challenges, and that as educators, I know that professors are working very much to make sure that students can overcome these challenges, but I think it still leaves a lot of things for students to have to worry about and plan around.
Right, definitely. It seems to be a mixed bag here, just from both of your perspectives that I've taken, Mariam's and Nadia's on this point of view. Amina, I want to come to you and talk to you about this. We know that the fault lines in so many sectors have become more evident because of this pandemic, and so is the same case with education, and so much of unequal access to education, unequal opportunities towards it, lack of access to resources, all of this has become blatantly apparent. Do you see this time as offering us an opportunity to actually work on all those things, or do you think that the gaps that became so visible right now are going to hurt the students long term?
Well, I think instead of during this pandemic, when everything was on stake, so as the higher education, it's really a great challenge to see that how for an underdeveloped country like Pakistan, with a minimum budget on education, the universities will be going to provide online education. But since March till September, what I see was another side that it has definitely improved the teaching quality. Reason being, when I looked 10 or 5 or 2 years back, I saw there was no online course directory for any public sector universities exclusively. There was no learning management systems provided by Higher Education Commission. But because of this pandemic, I think it was a great opportunity to provide a transparent kind of an education in which everything was available there online.
But was everything available? I'm not sorry to interject. Sorry to interject here. Was everything available online to everyone? That's the central question.
Yes, it was available to everyone, except for those who could not access to internet because they were living in some far-flung areas or things like that. Otherwise, it was, openly accessible to everyone. The university has provided the password and, ID to all the students and all the, faculty, because it was, endorsed by the Higher Education Commission that students have to have all the detailed material, the course content, the bifurcation of the marks for the exams, then the video and audio lectures recorded by the teachers, and then, the related content, which is the content which is related to, the course subject. So this is for the first time in the history that we have seen that all the universities, even the public sector universities, followed that guidelines, and they have developed their OCTs and LMS. So that was, I think, one of a very good step towards quality teaching and, transparency of teaching methods.
Right.
Second thing,
Amina, stay with me on that point. Stay on that very important point, because it opens an interesting door to another aspect of our discussion. Nadia, I want to take this point forward and talk about inaccessibility and how we saw that unfold during this pandemic. We know that the internet, there's unequal distribution of it all across in many, many countries. Many students have suffered because of it. But have there been more invisible ways that created barriers for students to continue their education during this time? I mean, when we say that everyone had everything available to them, do you see it in that same light?
The traditional way of attending university means being in the campus. The only good example and an excellent example, and I'm really proud of that when I talk about it, is the Allama Iqbal Open University, which has a very strong infrastructure of providing distance learning to the students in the far remotest areas in the Pakistan, where children have never even seen a school, but they are still learning through remote distance learning methods. So before pandemic, we in Pakistan had that infrastructure. So now the problem was that distance, most universities are located in the province of Punjab. Students move from remote village areas, move from the rural parts of the countries and go into urban cities where there is in university towns, where there are universities available. And living in those towns is a life-changing experience. Trust me, I have seen people changing their lives, their decisions once they move from from the rural to the urban locations because in pursuit of higher education. So for girls, this was one of the most difficult steps that they had to take. They had to fight a lot of barriers, parents, finances, who will support them, who will not support them. And then we had an excellent infrastructure of women's universities established in 4 provinces of Pakistan. And
all right. Nadia, pull in Mariam into this. Mariam, given how Nadia and Amina both paint an optimistic picture, a more rosy picture of this, the other side of this is that there is a threat that more children, more students will be out of school because of this pandemic, that it will in fact exacerbate those inequalities that already existed. Can you tell us if you think that is a greater threat, or do you think that the accomplishments or the opportunities that were available to students during this pandemic, that's the side you would want to stick with?
I think that one thing that is important is to kind of take a view that takes into account each nation a little bit more specifically. So, for example, in the US, we currently are at almost 190,000 deaths. I know other countries, of course, do not have such a high figure. And I think the thing that we need to remember is that this pandemic is still unfolding. It has not passed our experience. And so because of that, there are these ways that the pandemic continues to impact people's lives, people's families. And so in my estimation as a professor, I am more concerned about the survival of students at the moment than I am about whether or not they're getting their learning goals accomplished this year. And I think about this both as a professor and as a mother. So I think that's an important piece. And I think the other thing that we must keep in mind is that the corporatization of education, particularly higher education, but across the board, is one of the reasons why schools are being restarted so quickly in many countries, including in the United States. And in fact, over here in the school system, there is a requirement from the Department of Education that public schools must be hybrid or they won't get federal funding. And so there's a lot of kind of structural factors that go into how education is being impacted by the pandemic, how it's being impacted by a nation's response to the pandemic. And I think those aspects should not be lost, even as though I agree with my co-panelists that professors and teachers have been working extra hard this summer, putting in lots of hours and making sure that they are prepared. Because in March, when the lockdowns began, all of us were caught pretty off guard and had to quickly change our pedagogical and curriculum plans for the rest of the semester. We got through that, but this fall I know that many teachers around the world have been preparing all summer, and I do want to acknowledge their work. But at the same time, the inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic are still there. The inequalities have certainly been exacerbated. And for example, in the US, many of the private colleges and universities have enough funding to test teachers and students twice a week.
Mariam, I just want to echo your appreciation here, because I think it is important to recognize how tough and what an uphill battle it was to teach during this time. All the professors, all the teachers, all the administrators who worked so hard to make that happen. Of course, their efforts are widely acknowledged and appreciated. But to that point of the corporate creating these business models for these institutions and them operating on that basis. Nick, I want to take this question to you and talk to you about it. Have we begun to see how that system, when institutions, especially education institutions, are operating like businesses, how faulty that can be during times of crises, especially like the one that we saw right now?
Income and their expenditure in exactly the same way as businesses, that changes their behavior. And of course, around the world, universities are not businesses. They're often public sector institutions or they're independent charities. And they mustn't forget that educational purpose. But I'm really glad that you've raised the issue of financial resources and money, because this is a really challenging issue. We're likely to see a global recession on the back of the pandemic. So there will be less money around. It will be harder for many people to go to university, and it will be harder for universities to do all the things expected of them. You know, they are being expected to deliver online teaching and face-to-face teaching and have the latest information technology and keep all their students and staff safe. So the expectations on universities are very, very large. And I just hope that governments around the world continue to fund them properly, because at the moment, the alternatives to education are worse than ever. It's harder to get a job almost everywhere in the world than before the pandemic. So we mustn't forget the underlying value of education, so that we're stronger as you know, across the whole world when the pandemic finally comes to an end.
This underlying value of education that you refer to, we have been seeing in recent years record high numbers of youth unemployment. We've been seeing more and more students invest in university degrees, but not being able to reap the benefits of them in the job market. Has this also caused for us to rethink how we structure higher education in terms of how much of theory we focus on, how much practical skills we invest in? Do you think that there is an opening for us to reevaluate that as well?
I think we should always be questioning what it is we do in higher education. And if there are courses that are bad quality, then, you know, we need to either stop those courses or improve them. The difficulty is when people judge quality only on the earnings of people who've done that course. You know, you don't only go to university to become a millionaire or to get a very highly paid job. You go to be a more educated, more rounded person, perhaps to become a healthcare worker. And so we mustn't think of higher education or any education as being only about the money you get at the other end.
Of course, I take your point there. I take your point, and that's the point I'm going to take to Nadia here. Nadia, it's of course important in every discussion not to undermine or undervalue how much education means, but at the same time, there is a real cost to it. When students are going in debt trying to pay for their degrees, all of this combined, is there a need for us to rethink how we imagine higher education following this pandemic, following recessions, seeing how there will be wide-scale unemployment?
I believe there are so many facets to it. The main thing is the employability will be challenged as a normal as when students finish their university degree. So there is a normal time period of searching for jobs or trying for jobs, and then it looks like, oh, students are not getting jobs and they are unemployed, even having a degree from Oxford or Punjab University or LUMS. But that's just a phase in students' life. So I would say that degree holders are as compared to non-degree holders, are very unlikely to be out of the job market in context of Pakistan. So that's not a problem, I would say. However, there will be a problem for students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds or from remote areas who will not get enough threshold or the expected merits of big university to meet those threshold and get into higher education or get into university, the qualification that is the school level qualification that is required. So what will universities do for them? Number one, scholarships, better bursaries, much more contextualized admissions.
Amina, is that possible to open your doors so widely for all students to come? Is that a realistic expectation we can have from universities?
For as far as the financial aid is concerned, being a public sector university, I would like to give example of my university. At MS level, almost 80% of our students goes to scholarship. That's for true, confirm correct information. Like they went for USAID scholarships because most of them in my university belongs to a middle class or lower income group. So they tend to seek, need-based scholarships as well, and few of them goes for the merit scholarships as well. So I think there are already room for scholarships as far as the higher education is concerned. There are not much scholarships at, bachelor's level, but at MS and at PhD levels, Commonwealth Scholarship, Fulbright Scholarship, and there are so many others as well. As far as opening up the doors for everyone in the university on merit, this year the government has announced a new policy, and I'm sure that most of you would be aware of that this year each and every university is supposed to give just one prospect to the student who is even interested in taking admission in more than one discipline. So that's really a good, thing, because earlier the student used to, submit 3 or 4 or 5 prospects in one university, right? They have to buy so many prospects because they were interested in applying in different disciplines and they were not sure that for which merit they will fall on. So this is a good initiative that it will give, a centralized kind of admission policy, and much more students would be catered by just submitting one form. So in this way, this is a very, innovative vision that more and more students could be, apply for admission in one university.
Mariam, to all of this that we're discussing, when you see this and see all the challenges that were presented to universities, to colleges, to teachers during this time, what lessons do you think can be learned from all of this moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons, but I'm going to focus right now on one thing that I think we have not discussed so far, which is that as this pandemic has unfolded, we've also witnessed a global movement around Black Lives Matter, which has also been taking shape within Pakistan and in the United States. And the reason I bring this up is because students are experiencing the world and experiencing their lives within the pandemic, and experiencing kind of the inequalities that have come to the surface through this pandemic and the conversations that have come up. And I think that what that means is our students are changing. The students that I taught 5 years ago, they're very different than the students that are coming into college today. And I think that means that our pedagogy and our curriculum and our idea of education has to change. So this question came up of kind of what is the value of education, or what does education mean in a post-pandemic world, or in a world where perhaps we see more pandemics, which is another thing that many scientists are predicting. And so if this is the context that we are living in, if this is a future that we are resigned to, then we need to kind of take it a little bit more proactively and think about, well, if these inequalities do exist, for example, many people will discuss how there are these far-flung areas or Balochistan or remote areas, and that these are the areas that are being kind of left out. But I think there's a lot of other things that are going on that are impacting young people right now, and they're changing the way that they think about their place in the world. And so I think educators are going to have to really think about what it means to teach in this context, where perhaps certain kinds of employment will be less available if the global recession, for example, has the impact it has across the world. Right. And if that is the case, then perhaps we need to prepare them for new kinds of careers. We need to prepare them for new kinds of opportunities and a new world in which they need a different type of education. And so I think this is a challenge for educators to think and observe kind of how the next year or two plays out, and then respond so that way our students know that we are thinking about their future, which is very different from the world that we lived in before the pandemic.
Right. That's a very, very insightful perspective there, Mariam, and thank you for it. Nick, I want to put this last question to you and follow up from Mariam. I'm not going to ask you to bring about a definite answer of it because I know what a huge question it is, but just your thoughts. What does education mean in the post-COVID world, a world that is marked by so many other issues, recessions, unemployment, greater poverty levels, more political, more nationalism in many countries, all of these combined? What does education mean in the post-COVID world?
Above all, I think it means the same as it did before the pandemic, which is it's about opening up people's minds to different perspectives and new knowledge. And one thing we haven't had time to cover in huge detail today is, of course, education as a means of pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge. It will be educational institutions that find a cure for this horrible disease, for example, or that teach us how to live with it. So I think it's mainly about opening people's minds, but it's also about making the whole world a more knowledgeable place. In other words, progress. It's about progress.
Right. On that point, I'm going to end discussion today, even though it's very interesting and there's so much more that remains left to be covered. But that's all for today. And we're going to hopefully continue talking about this, how education is being impacted by this pandemic, what seems to be the way forward from this point onwards. Thank you so much, Dr. Amina Muazzam, for joining us from Lahore, Dr. Mariam Durrani for joining us from New York, Nick Hillman for joining us from Oxford, and Dr. Nadia Siddiqui for joining us from Durham. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to discuss how environment impacts child health. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. According to the World Health Organization, reducing environmental risks could prevent 1 in 4 child deaths. This means air pollution, inadequate water, and the climate all tremendously contribute in how healthy a child is. Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this conversation, Mr. Svein, who's the former UN Director and Director of Clima 2020, a climate consultancy. He joins us from Oslo. Also joining us today is Dr. Jack Singer, consultant pediatrician and chairman of Harley Street Pediatric Group, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Jack Singer, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about the environmental impacts on child health, how much of a connection is the medical community starting to make about these two things that seem to be very independent for a long time? But now that we're seeing more talk about climate change, more understanding of how it works, do you see there a growing concern of how these two impact each other?
Yes, there's always been a concern between environment and genetics in terms of the three major things are growth, development, the health of the child. And again, this has an impact on the economics and socialization, and it plays a central role in the child's development. There are only two things we're dealing with, if you pare it down, is genetics and environment. And it's the environment that's out of control at the moment, and it's getting worse. And it has an impact on every step of child health, from prenatal child health on to delivery, growth, development, and socialization.
Dr. Jack Singer, your expertise and your expert perspective, take us through how exactly this happens. I mean, how something in the environment that exists all around us can impact a child's, all of a child's life stages, in fact.
Well, I mean, a simple, not a simple, but an example would be, well, two examples. One is with neural tube defects and folic acid deficiency. Just a simple addition of folic acid into the diet of the mother before birth, during conception and afterwards prevents neural tube defects. We're involved in a large study in the Sudan looking at, actually, the name of the study is Prevention of Cerebral Palsy. And it's very simple. This is a group of 20,000 pregnant women who enroll in the study, and the criteria to be enrolled is simply to be pregnant. So it includes women who have all kinds of hemoglobin deficiencies, malaria, diet, HIV, and so on. And the difference, all we're doing is adding a fish oil, omega-3 to the diet, and we know that we can prevent at least 60% of cerebral palsy. Which is fantastic if you think about it, because this is a lifelong problem. It has nothing to do with intelligence.
Right.
And with a simple addition of fish oil, you can prevent at least 60% of these children having this condition. And we are using the Sudan is because the incidence of cerebral palsy there is 20 times higher than, say, in Europe. And the reason is because of the location.
Right. In this location, tell us more about it. How is the location impacting it? How the resources are impacting what you're telling us about?
Exposure to fish and fish oil, omega-3. It's just that simple.
Right. Dr. Jack Singer, stay with me. That's an interesting example you put forth, and I want to discuss more of this and discuss how different things that we don't seem to act as a threat to our health, and especially a child's health, are in fact actively impacting the health itself. Mr. Svein Tveitdal, when we're talking about the world that children are coming into, especially what we're seeing right now, a world that is already beginning to show signs of melting glaciers, of food insecurity, threats to water, so many different types of issues. How do you think this actually creates an environment that is threatening a child's well-being?
For the future, I think that climate change and nature loss will be the most severe threats. I have had the privilege over the last year or 2-3 years to visit Norwegian schools, and I've been discussing these issues with more than 10,000 students. And they understand what is happening. They are overly concerned and want politicians to do something with it. When I meet them, I tell them when I was at their age, I grew up on a small farm surrounded by nature that I thought would be there forever. We had 3 cows, no car, a bike and a horse were our transport means. But I had no fears and was completely happy. But if you had told me then about how the world is looking like today, I would not have believed it, thought it was a science fiction story. And now to the young people today, the situation is much more difficult because they understand the threats. They see we are not able to prevent them, and changes are going much, much, much faster than when I grew up. So when they try to imagine what the world is looking like when they are as old as I am now, it is not strange that they are afraid and protesting. They have a very tough future to face, actually.
Right. That is such a strong message you send out there, how the world has changed since you were a kid to what you see now, and especially what you see will happen in 20, 40, 60 years when the children of today will be adults, will be grandparents, how the world will look like then. Dr. Jaksinger, this point here is an important one because we often forget that things were different in the past decades. We see the issues of today in isolation, but when you see children and the issues they have, the respiratory illnesses, the various other health issues they have, how much of that do you contribute to the environment and to climate change?
Another great area which we always forget about is the dislocation of families and children in areas where there's an enormous amount of war going on. And if you just look at the pictures of these children, up from babies alone, on top of climate change, you have the politics which are driving all of these problems, which have a huge impact on the children, resulting in dislocation, no schooling, famine, nutrition, all the other areas, infectious disease and so on, is exacerbated by this great movement of people trying to move from one area, getting out of a war zone into another area.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, you mentioned how you have been actively having these discussions with thousands of students about climate change and how they're more aware and how they want politicians to act upon it. Dr. Jaksinger brings up a very essential point, which is about displacement, dislocation, and how that impacts child health. We know that climate change will exacerbate this issue. There will be many, many more migrations because of climate change. When you talk to children about this and you do it so in a political environment that has become more hostile towards refugees and migrants, how do you see that conversation going? Do children realize that refugees are in fact not a threat? It's climate change that's the threat?
In Norway, where I have this experience with the young people, it is not the climate refugees that is the biggest issue for them, even if there is a lot of discussion about refugees to Norway. So it is very clearly an issue. But I think the main point with the young people is that they really understand how big this threat is. And it is not so difficult to understand. Greta Thunberg, she is criticized because she is a young lady, but she's and cannot know all these issues. But she's only listening to the scientists that anonymously is saying that we are getting into a more and more difficult situation without doing anything. This is something the young people understand, and that's why they should be worried. We have to tell them the truth, and we have to come to much stronger action so that they can have a life that when they are at my age as I have today, and that is really threatened. It might not go that direction.
Mr. Tveitdal, do you have hope that this fragmentation all across the world that we see today in terms of dealing with refugees and those who are being displaced by war, by natural disasters, this issue of whether we should demonize them, or so many issues on that front. Do you have hope that the next generation will be more empathetic?
Of course, you need to have hope. There is no alternative to that. And young people are empathetic. But one issue related to climate refugees, for instance, when a threat is coming up, you can do one out of two things. You can fight to solve it, or you can cooperate to solve it. And when you talk about refugees, the kind of fighting mood is to build walls. And I don't think we can build walls that are high enough. So the solution is cooperation, and to help people out there in Sudan, as Dr. Singer mentioned, to solve their problems that they have there. Then we can avoid refugees. But yes, young people have empathy. They are willing to do something, and they require that we, that are old people now, is really helping them out, because they have not created this situation. We have posted on them, and I will not have a problem in my life because it is not that many years left. But the young people I'm talking to, they have the whole life in front of them. And if we are not doing anything today, that will be a troublesome life.
Well, Mr. Svein Tveitdal, we really hope that you have a long, happy life so you can have these discussions, engage with children on these issues that you're engaging with them on. Dr. Jack Singer, talking about this point that you raised about how it's such a huge threat to health, displacement. Take us through it, how a child becomes so much more exposed to environmental factors and the threats that face them if they're not provided proper shelter, proper refuge.
Well, all you have to do is look at the exposure that we have day to day on rolling 24-hour news of children, babies in hospitals that are bombed, so on and so forth. And most of these people, I am sure, do not want to move from their home. No one does. This is your home. You grew up there. This is your environment. Your friends, your relatives, your family is there. They're not economic migrants. I would think 90% are not economic migrants. What they are, however, are displaced persons due to war. Either war between communities within a country, or between countries, or different religious factions, right, and so on and so forth. And the end result is right before your eyes. You see babies who are starving, who have malnutrition, the onslaught of infectious disease, decrease in water supply, drinking water that isn't clean brings on more infectious disease. It's a vicious circle. And these people are displaced because they don't want to be displaced. It's because they're forced to leave, and they're running out of places to go to. It's just that simple, I think. I mean, unfortunately, it's simple, but it's difficult to reconcile how to deal with all of these multitude of problems at the same time. And unfortunately, babies on up are the people who suffer the most and are traumatized the most, because I mean they're losing arms. They have war injuries. This is not what a child should have. They don't have any schooling. They don't have any adequate food. They've lost one or more parents, they've lost their entire home, and they've lost their whole reason to be in existence in a way.
Right, Dr. Jack-Singer, how can the medical community, I know there's not so many resources at the disposal of medical communities unless governments invest, but how can there be outreach programs to those who are underprivileged and those who are struggling and the most amidst these climate issues, amongst so much that's happening in the world?
The thing is, a lot of this is we've got two huge problems. One is the environment and the changing environment. This impacts everyone around the world. It's the same as if you've created a beautiful house and now you're pulling it down around you. And I'm sure a lot of those issues can be solved. But the other issue, which is also deeply ingrained, is the political problems. And hopefully these will be solved over time as the older generation relinquishes power and the newer generation looks at what is reality and what's going on around them, and they have to come to some accommodation. And at the end of the day, once that happens, there'll be enormous changes in reducing the flow of immigration and so on, which in turn will make an improvement in the environment of these people, and they can go back to their own homes again and resume a reasonably normal lifestyle.
Right. Mr. Svein Tveitdal, I want with this point, and it's an alarming point, but I think it's important to drill the point home that you've been making, that Dr. Jack-Singer has been making. By 2040, an expected 2 degrees Celsius raise in average temperatures is being predicted. How will that devastate the conditions we've been seeing today? What will the world look like for today's children?
Well, what we will see is more and severe impacts from what we already are seeing today. Water scarcity, less food production, more people, more refugees from crop failure, from sea level rise, and more extreme weather. And one thing we haven't talked about today is so much what is happening in the rich world. But there was a new report today saying that, for instance, in England, almost 60% of the people live in areas where level of toxic air pollution exceed legal limits. And this includes 7 million children, which is more than half of the children in England. So if these things are happening in our part of the world, we might be more willing to help the poor people. And one thing that I think is important to say when we talk about young people and environment is that they are more vulnerable than adults because their bodies are still growing. And they are, for instance, eating and drinking more per weight unit than adults, so that makes them more vulnerable. But in summary, we have the means to solve the problems, but the cost is increasing and the time squeeze is more and more strong.
Right, and the consequences of climate change are irreversible in many, many instances. It's difficult to get glaciers to grow back. It's difficult to get many things to happen that we're seeing happening right now as a consequence of inaction. Thank you so much, Mr. Svein Tveitdal, for joining us from Oslo, Dr. Jack-Singer for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.